Hello everyone, this is Fionapollo and I do art commentary. And surprise surprise, I'm also a huge fan of Steven Universe. It's a show that means a lot to me. It took off shortly after I decided to pursue animation after high school, and it inspired me to pursue projects that I truly enjoyed and taught me to support and fight for things I believed in. This show was instrumental in my own personal journey towards so many things, including self-acceptance as a queer person. So you can imagine how much I disliked the surrounding discourse that developed around 2016 onwards. Videos that came from Lily Orchard and the like really just reinforced a fear that a lot of queer people have that our tolerance was conditional, even so far as a kid's show, and very often outside of our control no matter how well-intentioned we may be. So I guess it would be needless to say that I have been really happy to see that a lot of the vitriol surrounding the show that has plagued its reputation for years is recently being examined and re-evaluated. Seeing people watch the show with no prior knowledge and coming to the conclusion that, yeah, a hefty amount of the criticisms were over-exaggerated was refreshing to say the least. I'm a bit salty that it took so long, but whatever, we're getting there, that's the important thing. But even with that going on, despite the fact that a lot of the more outrageous talking points have settled, several topics that were present during the show's run have also cropped back up, including one of the show's most divisive themes that I'd like to talk about today, fusion. Fusion is an allegory within the show to signify different individuals coming together to take on a new form. During the show's run, and at a time when gay marriage was only just becoming legalized in the states where the show was made, this type of union between characters was taken as a way to depict romantic relationships while avoiding censorship. It was very clever in that respect, but the problem with it though is that some thought that this was all fusion was meant to represent, and were subsequently very confused when family members or the like also fused in the show, leading to some of the more scathing criticisms of the show's moral compass. There has been so much contention and debate as to what fusion is and what it should mean or could imply that I kind of wanted to look into it and give my own thoughts on the matter, because, well, fusion as a concept is subjective enough that it can be an allegory for many different things, and this can mean there is even a chance of people taking either the best or worst possible interpretations of it. Let's be frank, Steven Universe was a landmark show. Without it, we wouldn't have nearly as much queer rep in cartoons or TV at large as we do, or at the least, we wouldn't have had it all so quickly. And while we would all like for that to be because it was overwhelmingly positive, which it was, don't get me wrong, the show was great, what really helps to incite change is when something can strike up an intense conversation that gets people thinking and talking, which is exactly what fusion did. So let's talk about it. If you like what you're hearing, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I talk a lot about art topics, cartoons, pop culture, and the like. Also, feel free to comment on what your own thoughts on fusion might be. Feedback is always appreciated here, I don't always hit the mark myself, and it's nice to read other people's perspectives. And while we're at it, who is your favourite fusion in the show? Alright, let's begin! Part 1. The nature of fusion. So what is fusion at a glance? As described by Pearl in Season 1, fusion is when gems perform a synchronized dance to combine into a more powerful fusion gem. As the series progresses, we find that the dance part is less so necessary than the intent, and is more so present to represent characters getting onto the same wavelength to function as a singular unit. Some gems can fuse just by hugging, holding hands, etc. The first time we see fusion, it's framed as an extreme measure when more synchronized teamwork is required to tackle an obstacle. In Giant Woman, the episode which introduces fusion, Steven gets eaten by a giant bird, and both Pearl and Amethyst fuse to become Opal in order to save him. When we're introduced to it in this context, it's very difficult, at least for me, to read it with any kind of romantic intent, unless you're in the fandom and like to ship Amethyst and Pearl together. But nothing in the show itself outside of that actually implies that this was the case at this point. It's very clear here that the fusion is meant to signify a sense of teamwork, coordination, and reliability on each other, and while romance can include those aspects, so can non-romantic relationships. In short, the show leaves it very open to interpretation. If you really wanted to dig into the nature of each fusion, the best source is probably within the music. Each Steven Universe character has their own musical style and instrument associated with them, and these musical elements will often combine when characters fuse. The names for each of their fusion songs can also be an indicator of the nature of the relationship. In Opal's case, the theme is called amalgam. It's not a strictly romantic term, but more so one that implies the process of two entities being meshed together, much like how Amethyst described hers and Pearl's fusion at the beginning of the episode. When asked about the nature of fusion, Rebecca Sugar, the show's creator, explained how when two people come together, they are often interpreted as a single entity. Two people dating? People see them as a couple and view them as almost different people as opposed to when they're separate. Same with friends, same with siblings, work colleagues, sports teams, rock bands. There are so many examples of this concept, and it's unsurprising that more people didn't cotton on to this right away. This is a show for kids, but that's kind of the beauty of these kinds of shows with more nuanced themes. They have more rewatch value as you grow up because they don't talk down to the audience, and you know notice more stuff after multiple viewings. And one other reason for more people not realizing this may be in part due to the trajectory that Fusion took as the series pushed on, most notably with the leader of the Crystal Gems, Garnet. It was speculated right from the get-go that Garnet was a character of interest, even from episode 1, given that she had 2 gems instead of 1 on each hand, and this intrigue was only heightened after the concept of fusion was introduced. And we finally got our answer in the episode Jailbreak after she gets poofed by Jasper and reforms as 2 separate gems, Ruby and Sapphire. Steven comes across them both and helps them reunite, which is when they fuse to become Garnet once again. And this is where the original concept of fusion that we are introduced to back in Giant Woman is finally challenged. Bear in mind, Jailbreak is episode 53, Giant Woman was episode 12, so we've had ample time for the subject of fusion to be mulled over at this point. Garnet is not constantly in a life or death situation. She isn't staying fused as a strategic action. She's just a fusion because she likes to remain fused. Before this, in the context of the show, we were taught a very similar thing about fusion that appears to be taught on the Gem's homeworld that other characters like Peridot also repeat later on in the series. On homeworld, the only time a fusion is considered acceptable is for combat, such as with the rubies all forming to create a much larger and stronger ruby. Gems of other varieties mixing is considered taboo and wrong for reasons that don't really have much explanation or even merit. And this mindset pretty much lines up with how people view gay couples in the real world, especially if we think of fusion in a similar manner to having a child or even marriage. There's always that bias in real life among many people that queer parents will result in queer children every time, which is false. A person will be whatever sexuality they turn out to be regardless of parentage. The only reason queer children are supposedly more common among queer parents is because they are more readily accepted, and that's the end of it. But what is also present within this bias is the lack of understanding that certain things in life aren't a necessity, and choosing to do things for yourself in a non-traditional way isn't a detriment. The parallel between how the rubies fuse as a necessity to become more powerful versus Garnet fusing out of love and as a result being stronger for it communicates a pretty clear-cut idea that self-acceptance and love makes you a naturally more rounded person who is more able to tackle things that life throws at you. And this logic doesn't just apply to being queer. Straight couples have a right to not get married or have kids either. It's a topic that affects everyone. The idea of going against that just happens to be more centralized towards the queer experience. What's even more interesting is Garnet's reaction to Steven finding out that she's a fusion, almost like she was worried about how to tell him or what he would think. And this also feels very painfully accurate to the anxiety around introducing a younger relative to your spouse for the first time and them not knowing that you're queer. Thankfully, this doesn't seem to be as big of a shock for the younger generations anymore, at least where I live. My niece practically didn't even lift her head up when I told her, but back 10 years ago, this was all still a pretty significant thing that people fretted about. And it still is today in many places, especially if that child had a traditional or conservative upbringing. But that's why shows like this are so important. The way that Steven Universe has basically used fusion to walk us through our pre-existing perceptions of relationships via Giant Woman, where a working relationship is only a necessity under certain circumstances, such as for example being told that you have to get married or have children in the traditional manner, versus when we get to Jailbreak and we see that those necessities aren't really all that relevant and what should be at the forefront is whether you want to pursue them on your own terms, traditional or not, is probably one of the most clever ways that I have seen such relationship dynamics broken down and portrayed to children to understand and figure out as they continue watching. But while that all may be well and good, it still probably doesn't quell a lot of the turmoil surrounding the implications of such relationships that are all lumped under the fusion umbrella. We talked a little bit about non-romantic relationships, but what about those who opt out of the relationship dynamic altogether? People who don't want to be defined by their relationships but also feel like they have no choice. What about people who share a close bond with friends, loved ones, or even colleagues that outsiders don't really get or misinterpret? Part 2. To fuse or not to fuse. By nature, it feels like the topic of fusion is a pretty esoteric issue. People who only view romantic relationships as the ones that matter obviously aren't going to fully appreciate something like fusion under anything other than that very narrow scope. I don't know if it's the asexuality or the autism or both talking, but I've always found that with many shows, not just with Steven Universe, the topic of relationships becomes one that causes a pretty significant amount of uproar regardless of intent. Firstly because, well, fandom. People like to ship characters, it's cute, it's harmless, I'm not mad about it as long as you're not shipping anything weird like siblings. But a small issue with that is that fandom ships often rely on minimal cues, implications, or theorems to solidify an often heavily romantic relationship, which I think is why sometimes fandoms can clash with writers or creators who maybe didn't intend that type of relationship, not because they're homophobic or they don't like those characters together, but because jumping straight into romance and hyper-focusing on only that leaves very little room to ruminate on the nuances within other types of interpersonal relationships. And that's really what Steven Universe is about. It's a show about love in all of its different forms. With a show like SU that has the concept of multifaceted interpersonal relationships at its core that don't always rely on shipping, this can become a bit complicated because the show was also such a pillar for queer representation in media at the time that the implication of denial towards such relationships was viewed as a personal affront to many fans at the height of its popularity. But the thing is, such non-romantic relationships can be just as important to put at the forefront of such a show because, well, queer representation and the biases of those outside of the community kind of place queerness into this weird paradox. Queerness is more than just relationships. It can also encompass things that cross over to non-queer experiences as well, like self-expression, choosing not to conform to heterosexual beauty standards, choosing not to have children, and so on. But then you also have people who are convinced that queerness is all about and can only be about who you're being intimate with, despite the fact that the existence of identities such as asexuals and aromantics already prove that to be a flawed notion. But then these same people who are branded as deviants are expected to disprove this accusation, often by portraying a very heavily sanitized, almost Puritan version of the community that wipes away a lot of the history behind these interpretations. So then, in the context of a children's TV show that attempts to explore the nuances of these types of relationships and be inclusive of all different types of people within the community, it's no wonder that some people start to believe that Stephen and Greg fusing is some kind of Alabama moment, even though any normal person can see that it was intended to represent a father and son bonding over a shared enthusiasm of music.
How'd you guys meet then?
We're cousins.
I also had a classmate in my bachelor's class who very much embodied this kind of idea, who was insistent that fusion was a euphemism for spicy times, and that Ruby and Sapphire were constantly doing the do, which, first of all, is just a really weird way to interpret a pair of characters in a children's TV show again, but also further proves the sometimes unconscious reinforcement that being queer is somehow inappropriate by nature and without fail. I'm also personally of the opinion that not every character had to fuse, which is also a valid point regarding how certain people can just coexist outside of an easily labelled partnership, and I don't think any characters exemplify that more than Lapis and Peridot. We can safely assume that Peridot, for the majority of her existence, has been told that only certain gems are allowed to fuse, and do so only for combat, and this is also proven when she calls Garnet a war machine in the episode When It Rains. I know that there is a bit of a debate as to whether Peridot should have been shown fusing with someone, and one of the main arguments for that is that Peridot is heavily autism coded, and such characters, and even autistic people in real life, have a long history of being socially othered. Allowing Peridot the chance to fuse with someone would have been a good way to bridge that aspect of her personality, but I also don't think the show's choice to not make her fuse was a bad one either. To me, something that feels a bit overlooked in Peridot's character arc in the show is that she's kind of scared of commitment if you look really closely. Think about it, she takes a long time to come around to the crystal gems and prefers to stick to what she knows, and barely steps out of her comfort zone until later on when she feels less isolated. Her role in the story feels less to me like the social outcast and more like the hermit who the rest of the group need to meet halfway. It's not just up to Peridot to bridge that gap. Hey, editing Apollo here. So I went on a bit of a tangent here with diving into the nature of Peridot's perceived neurodivergency and completely forgot to even mention that the fandom largely interprets her to be error-based, which is also largely speculated to be why she is shown to never fuse. Just keep that in mind. I've recently thought that Peridot's lack of wanting to fuse but being close to the group can also kind of be interpreted in a similar way to parallel play, which is a documented pattern of behaviour found in autistic people that is recognised often in early childhood, hence the term play, where an autistic individual will go about their own business doing something, but will still want to be in the company of another person without the pressure of social interaction. It's kind of like when a cat wants to be in the same room as you but doesn't actually want to be fussed over. And then we have Lapis, who swung wildly in the other direction. Lapis was forced into being isolated for thousands of years while being trapped in a mirror, and craved some form of companionship, which is what finally freed her. But then, shortly after, when it felt like she was faced with a threat of being trapped again, combined with being given a chance at retribution, Lapis flung herself into a fusion with Jasper, forming Malachite, only to trap them at the bottom of the ocean to stop Jasper from harming Steven. Malachite herself was an incredibly smart way of portraying a toxic relationship both figuratively and quite literally, as a Malachite stone combined with water can cause serious health issues such as kidney and liver damage if ingested. After Lapis is finally freed, she wrestles with the aftermath of such a traumatizing event, the driving force of which was indeed fusion. Something that I think Steven Universe should be praised more for is its depiction of how recovery from trauma is not linear. Lapis constantly relapses and has to battle her own impulses and insecurities throughout the show, and often loses to them. And this lapse in recovery and sudden emergence of trauma in Steven is a really compelling aspect of the final season's Steven Universe future. I understand that many people have very mixed feelings on the final season, but that's a topic for another day. But something that a lot of you probably don't want to hear is that sometimes there are certain obstacles that you can just never get over. That doesn't mean that your progress will stop by any means. You can probably get over the next obstacle no problem, but that particular thing that caused you so much heartache and so much pain might just be better off avoiding instead of breaking down at the mere thought of having to face it. And that's how I typically viewed the relationship between Peridot and Lapis. One is a hermit who, while they were willing to experiment, as seen with Garnet in the episode Log Date 7152, ultimately found that it was a step too far beyond where they were willing to go. And the other had only just managed to scramble out of the deep end and is doing their best to keep their head above water. Sometimes it's easier to just coexist separately, but still together. And sometimes you can be just as happy living this way. I think a fundamental thing regarding fusion that people sometimes forget is that there can be just as many reasons for an interaction or relationship to not result in a fusion, and these reasons can be just as introspective and fascinating. Would it have been cool to see Lapis and Peridot fuse? Absolutely, but I also respect the choice to not go in that direction, and in some ways, I find it even more compelling. Part 3. The experience. Probably the biggest and often most frustrating thing surrounding a conversation like this is that many will tout the safety of children as their main point of concern when arguing against discussions of the queer community, even when it's clearly obvious that this is a gross exaggeration as well as a double standard 95% of the time. Not only that, it's been proven time and again that even when you try to suppress the knowledge around something, this doesn't stop that thing from taking place, and it most certainly doesn't help to protect anyone, but it makes the experience of learning and participation all the more dangerous. When you equip children with the tools and knowledge to understand something without attaching shame or disgust to it, you minimize the risk of them being stuck in troubling situations and then not telling you. If people really are so desperate to assert the idea that fusion is inherently a sexual concept, then I don't know about you, but I think I'd rather my kids learn about it through a colourful TV show about friendship that also reinforces the importance of healthy, understanding, and communicative relationships, as opposed to sneaking around in an adult space they have no business being in that could potentially hurt or traumatize them, or both. I wanted to save arguably the most pivotal fusion for last in regards to this discussion, because I think they embody pretty much everything to do with why talking about the complexity of relationships tied in with the queer experience is so important, and why it tends to make such big waves. And that fusion is Stevonnie, the fusion between Steven, the very first human-gem hybrid, and Connie, the first known regular human to have been able to fuse. The thing about Steven and Connie is that even though they are kids in the show, it is also a coming-of-age story for Steven, especially as someone who is neither fully human nor fully gem. So naturally, over the span of the show's timeline, both Steven and Connie are also becoming adolescents, and a lot of Stevonnie's appearances and relevance in the main story revolves around firsts. Within the context of the actual plot, they're the first fusion to involve a human with no connection to gems, and this can be taken to signify how younger generations are able to follow in their guardians' footsteps, but are also eventually able to surpass them. This is most obvious when we look at Rose and Greg. The two are from completely different worlds but found a way to live harmoniously, while Stevonnie represents the bridge between these worlds and embodies this sense of an entirely unwalked territory. Steven, Rose, and Pink Diamond in the later seasons all share a narrative that is very steeped in the trans experience, an individual who isn't happy with the way things are, the way they are, and seek out their own community and space to be themselves, free of judgment. And Stevonnie also plays into that by being a stand-in for how the trans umbrella and most particularly non-binary identities are now being more widely recognized among the younger generations as of late. Despite the fact that Connie and Steven are at the surface a straight couple, Stevonnie is also an incredibly interesting look into how it can feel being a queer kid and being in a queer relationship while also having to grow accustomed to how your own body changes, how you present yourself, and how others might perceive you. In Stevonnie's debut episode, Alone Together, there are a number of ways that this is shown. First, through the fusion itself, the acknowledgement of this new and unknown experience that can also be scary for non-queer kids. Then through the act of telling a trusted loved one, having them instill a sense of understanding, intrigue, and even enthusiasm for this new experience. You then also have the realization that people are starting to view you in a different light than they once did in how Lars and Sadie react to Stevonnie at the donut shop, which then leads to a sense of uncertainty. And this is something that a person commented when I put the feelers out for this topic, but there is a very important scene in this episode where both Steven and Connie are conversing through Stevonnie and asking each other if they want to continue being fused. And this very brief checking of consent, I would say, is arguably one of the most important scenes in the show when you take into account the target audience. Learning to understand and respect boundaries is an immensely important thing for a variety of situations. Asking if someone wants a hug, if they want to go somewhere, if they want to have a drink, if they want to go home, and of course, if they want to take something in a relationship a step further. And this is why I feel like Fusion is such a genius way to communicate these often difficult to broach topics to a younger audience. It teaches them to try and understand things and people with a sense of empathy, and also to back off if it feels necessary. And that's really what all relationships, romantic or not, are about. And it's also what these kinds of shows are about. People often forget that animated shows and cartoons have lessons in them for a reason, especially if it's in regards to a common occurrence in real life that's becoming more common by the day. Surprise, surprise, if you live in the Western world, then your kids are gonna come across the LGBTQ eventually just walking around. I remember a very similar critique being lobbied at Craig of the Creek a few years ago for acknowledging black activism, but if you have or know a black kid, they're gonna be exposed to those kinds of circumstances that are depicted in the show. I understand that cartoons can be an escape, but you also can't mollycoddle children forever, and pretending these things don't exist is only going to kneecap them when they're finally faced with reality. There are many more examples of different relationships and all the different themes and perspectives they can encompass in the show, and I'll be honest and say that I'm way overdue a rewatch of the entire series in order to delve into all of them, so there are some fusions I would have liked to chat about more, such as Fluorite and Megapearl, but for now, I'll leave you with this. Relationships in all forms are things that require one very important thing: connection. And this connection can have a range. It can be all-engulfing, it can fuel both obsession and grief, it can make you go crazy, or it can be extremely simple. It can be subtle. It can be two strangers at a bus stop sharing a look when the bus is late. It can be two roommates sitting in the same room but not really interacting. And it can even be a parent and child learning to embrace each other's differences and celebrating similarities. Connection is a deeply beautiful thing, and I think this show's crowning achievement was showing just a few ways in which it can take form. Sorry to get all melodramatic on you towards the end, but hey, sometimes you gotta commit. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I've wanted to do a video talking about Steven Universe for so long, and I'm honestly really happy that I finally got to do that, and it would mean the world to me if you would all help it to do well. What do you think of everything I said? Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I missed? Want to talk about your favourite fusion? Please do. It would really help the channel out. Stay safe, everyone, and I will speak to you soon. Bye!
I just wanna be heard. But right now I'm